So just to begin, my name is Deanna Fong. I'm here with Mathieu Aubin, Daphne Marlatt, and Carole Itter. And today is the 5th of April, 2021, Easter Monday, in fact. So I suppose as an opening question, how did you two meet each other and how did you decide to get started on this project?
Oh, I've been practicing on that one because I don't have a clear memory of when Daphne and I exactly met, but I had moved into Strathcona Neighbourhood, and I think maybe within a year or two, Daphne and her partner Roy Keoka moved in, and we, I think, met through him. I had been a student of Roy's, and Daphne, you want to carry on, Daphne, as how you remember it?
Yeah, well, I think I met you before we moved in, Carole.
I was at a party at your house, actually. Yes, once. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Roy and I moved in '76, and you were in that little house on the corner of Pender and Heatley. High up, you had to climb up steps. It was one of those areas in Strathcona where the street had been leveled, so you have houses at different levels on the opposite sides of the street. Oh. And I loved going over there. We sat and chatted, and we both had kids at that point, so we talked about that a bit, but we were also talking a lot about Benny's Market. And we both frequented Benny's Market for groceries and things. And we were both really impressed by Raymond Benedetti and his stories about the neighborhood and growing up. So I think maybe that's what got us started. We had a sense just walking around the neighborhood. I mean, it was a much more Asian neighborhood then. I loved hearing Cantonese spoken on the street because it reminded me of my childhood in Penang. Mm-hmm. And there was a kind of a pull to figure out, well, who did live here and for how long and what kinds of people were they? So that was my memory of how we started, Carole.
Mm-hmm. And I think you had past experience with the provincial archives here. When they heard where you were and you were in good contact with them, they suggested that we think about compiling an oral history of this neighborhood. I say we, at that point, it was you in conversation with them.
Right. Yes. Yeah, because I'd started working with Reynoldston Research and Studies in '72 out of the basement of the library at UBC. And then they wanted me to do a book on their work, their oral history work in Steveston. A lot of those interviews, all the interviews really were done by Maya Koizumi in Japanese, and she transcribed them or translated them, and we went from there. But it became part of they lost their funding at one point, and it became part of, it became a program in the provincial archives. And that's who published both Steveston Recollected, the oral history of Steveston, and Opening Doors.
And where does your own interest in oral history come from?
It's quite personal, really. It was based on my own experience, I guess, growing up in Penang as a young child and being surrounded by all these different languages. It was very multicultural even then. And when I went to Steveston with a friend, soon after I moved back from the States to Vancouver, we drove to Steveston, and they still had some of the old cannery camp shacks up. And I just got a sense of the lives of the Japanese Canadian fishermen by walking through those shacks. And I thought, oh, I'd love to find out more about them. And then, of course, when I was approached by Bill Langlois at Reynoldston to do this book, I thought, good, I'll find out more. And then when we moved here, that interest in people's lives, it was still, of course, there. For instance, I remember I started a little garden in the backyard of the Spota housing we lived in. And the Chinese lady from across the street, not across the street, but across the alley, had her garden, and she was gardening, and she saw me, and she came over with a garlic bulb and said, and showed me. I mean, she couldn't speak English. I couldn't speak, I think it was Cantonese. But she showed me how to pull apart the little cloves of garlic and plant them. And I was so struck by that. And then, of course, there was all this conversation. There was a garage in the alley, and these guys would come and hang out and meet there and chat for long hours. And every day, Roy did a video piece on that.
Yes.
Quite wonderful. So there was a sense, and you'd go to the park in the evening, and it would be full of kids, mostly Chinese kids, playing around, swinging on the swings, having a wonderful time. And it was such a feeling of a village, really.
Yeah. And how about you, Carole?
Mine is somewhat similar in so much as I think when I moved here, there was something on the street going on that I hadn't seen anywhere else in Vancouver. And it was that people said hello to each other, and that it was so easy to meet your neighbors, and that people love to tell stories. And I was just sort of wide open and all ears. This was quite different for me in neighborhoods. I hadn't seen anything quite like this. And not only that, the sidewalks were full of people, always. I'm not saying jam-packed, but I'm saying there was always people out on the sidewalks. And here, this maybe because we live on narrow lots, and so there was lots of people walking around. Certainly the corner store turned out to be a small gold mine for people interested in oral history, because you could walk in there at any time of the day, and Raymond Benedetti and also his mother would begin, and you'd be enthralled. I say I was enthralled by what I was hearing. And the stories were sometimes hair-raising and always entertaining and sometimes hilarious. And, just listening to stories of amazing stories of human behavior and what happens to people in a lifetime, So I was all ears. It became not an O-R-A-L history, but an A-U-R-A-L history, a listen to history, because of these feelings.
And there was such a sense of history, because Benny's Market was started by Raymond's father in, I think it was 1912. So right away we got a sense. I mean, he was very proud of this. We got a sense of the depth of history in this neighborhood before we even found out that it was really the first residential neighborhood in what became Vancouver.
And so I guess starting from that point of knowing that these stories are circulating and wanting to get in touch with the past of the neighborhood that you lived in, how did you go about conducting the interviews? This is a big question, I see.
You're asking, how did we find these people?
Yeah, how did you figure out who you wanted to interview, and how were people generally when you approached them and said, do you have a story to tell?
Oh, that's a really big question. Let's spend some time on it, Daphne, because I think we'd listen to one person and they'd say, and you really must meet so-and-so because they have a really good memory and it goes back further than mine. And, they can tell you lots more. So we would just jump on that name and find out how we could contact that person. And then as politely as possible, introduce ourselves one way or another. I remember, now this is a change in these past 50 years for sure, but at that time, possibly the gentlest way to introduce ourselves without being too intrusive initially was to send a letter, a simple letter, introducing ourselves and asking if we could record them. We never really were as brazen to knock on anybody's door and say, here we are and here's our equipment, you know.
Right. No.
We never did that, but there was many different directions. I remember going in and we were following leads constantly. We weren't all that systematic, you know. It was an incredibly diverse neighborhood. There were sometimes 57 different languages spoken at the neighborhood school, and it certainly was the center of the Jewish community, the Italian community, the Chinese community. So many Ukrainians lived here. Fill me in here, Daphne, but it was the East End, the Black community. Yes, yeah. And if we were systematic at all, it was that we had a lot of extra reading to do ourselves to bring us up to date on why they had come to Canada. And we had sense that we had to be fairly well informed before we went in to ask questions of people and what they did here. So maybe that's where we were.
And also when we heard about incidents, especially things like the much storied murder that happened when the police chief was killed in the neighborhood, we had to go and check everything in the newspapers. So there was a lot of time spent looking through old newspaper files at the public library. And the historic division of the public library was wonderful because they had many photographs, and a number of them were from this neighborhood. So we could get copies of them and show them to people. And sometimes people would show us their own photographs. And that always sparked storytelling. Yeah. But people were very generous. There was still such a strong sense of community then. That the people who were still here or who had grown up in the neighborhood were quite happy to talk about their experiences here, their feelings about the neighborhood, about a lot of it was about what strong communities people had, how that they helped one another. And so that sense of helping one another, I think, somehow managed to extend to us. I think people were very helpful to us. And they were wonderful. They gave us tea, they gave us coffee, they gave us cookies. And we tried to be as relaxed as possible about it to make it seem like just a conversation. We even had I remember we had our mic in a glove, a woolen glove stuck in a glass on the coffee table or dining table where we were seated with whoever we were interviewing. And we knew it wasn't very official, but I think it made people feel at home. And, oh, these are just two neighborhood women wanting to find out about where they live.
And when we forgot the glove, we'd have to ask them if they had a cloth napkin we could wrap around the microphone, which meant they had to get up out of their chair and go find the cloth napkin. But it sort of made us look a little bit hokey, a little amateurish. But it broke some of the stiffness between us too. And always these were generous people, you know. And we didn't do any sort of counting or measuring of data in advance. And I mean by that I don't recall, Daphne, do you, that we saw that there was a majority of a certain ethnic group in the neighborhood, so we must have that amount in the book. I don't remember thinking that way necessarily.
I don't think we did think that way until we came to close to the end, and there was talk of making a book. Yeah. And then I think we tried to cover, I think we were so drawn to the Italian community because of the connection with the Benedettis, that we interviewed a lot of Italian immigrant families here. I mean, people who were Italian Canadian but had grown up in immigrant families. I remember I felt that we hadn't interviewed enough Chinese Canadians. And that was more difficult for us because the old people didn't necessarily speak English. So in some cases, we had to go with an interpreter, or we had to, in one case, we actually asked somebody to interview this person and then transcribe the interview, translate it, I mean, and so on. There's a gap. I realized looking back over the book that there must have been a number of Russian people here, because there's a Russian hall, there's a Russian Orthodox church, on both of them on Campbell, but I don't think we interviewed a single Russian person.
And I remember being told that when I was in the Russian community hall on another sort of art business thing, that, there were no Russians in the book. Why? And I have no answer. Maybe this is time to tell the story of meeting one of the very special members of the Black community, because we finally had the possibility of interviewing a woman named Nora Hendricks. And Daphne and I, we were in our 20s in the 1960s. We grew up on the music of Jimi Hendrix. And of course, we were told that this was his grandmother. So we had a number of discussions between us about how we were going to approach her if the family did say, yes, we could meet her. She was well into her 90s. And it came back eventually that, yes, we could meet her. You and I were both so excited. And, we were so excited that we were going to meet Nora Hendricks. And we both love to swim. So prior to the interview, we both went and did about 10 or 15 lengths of the local pool to calm ourselves down so that we would be speaking at her rate,
Get all that excess
nervous energy out of us. We didn't fall asleep during the interview, of course. She was utterly fascinating, and she had a mountain of her own stories to tell. And we'd already decided we weren't going to bring up his name, but we walked into a home that was just filled with music. She was living with other family members at this point. And what do you call that rim around the top of a picture plate? Picture rail were albums of music. So this was a family who was just full of music, and all their friends were entertainers and great musicians, so, and they had intermarried too. So it felt really comfortable in that respect. And the family members all stayed in another room, and they were very proud. They had set Nora Hendricks up in a wonderful chair, and they were very proud of her. And she had some rough stories to tell us about the acute discrimination that was going on towards Black people in early Vancouver. And it was really worthwhile and really riveting to listen to her. Did we finally at the end talk about her grandson, ask her about her grandson?
We did, yeah.
Finally,
yeah. We didn't say much, and she didn't say a lot either, except that he used to come up and spend time with her,
And there's been biographies out on him now, and he didn't come up too often. She was the side of the family that he didn't see too often. But he came up in the summers and stayed for a week or two. It wasn't the side of the family he knew really well.
And then we interviewed another nonagenarian who was very well known in the Black community, Rosa Pryor, of Pryor's Chicken Inn in Hogan's Alley. And she told a wonderful story about how she started and how they had so little money. She actually sent away to her mother in the States and asked to borrow some money to start up the little business. And the mother had to borrow money from friends of hers. And it took a while. And in the meantime, she'd managed to acquire money from somebody up here. And so she just sent the money back to her mom after it finally arrived. But she said that they started with, I think it was $2 for a chicken, and, buy it in Chinatown. And her husband, who was this very large man, they both were quite large apparently, because there were a number of fights that would occur, and they never lost one, she said. He would have to go over quickly when they got a customer, go over quickly to buy a chicken with the money that the previous customer had paid them. And she would keep the new customer chatting while he got back and put the chicken on.
Yeah. Yeah. So the talk is really sort of woven into everyday life in every aspect. Hey?
Yeah. That was what was so fascinating. Mm-hmm. It was every aspect. It was very, and there was so much music. The Italians talked about music too. All the festive days had music. They celebrated with music, singing and so on. And people sang the songs of the countries that they had come from, the old folk songs and so on.
One of my immediate neighbors, John Cressetti, his house was almost parallel to mine. He was an elder, and I guess we met him through me having said hello on the street a little bit. Well, when he'd had a few beers and it was coming home in the earlier days, and my house was propped on the hill, he'd be singing Italian arias from operas. And I was just dumbfounded. Does this happen in every neighborhood? He had a wonderful voice, and he's walking along the street and he's so happy and he's singing songs, and he has a good voice, so.
Wow. Yeah.
There was lots of people who played string instruments too. I think every culture had string instruments.
Yeah, that's right. And the Jewish families used to go to Stanley Park for picnics, and they would play cards. The guys would play cards and the women would chat. And I think they sang too.
Love that. You get such a sense of the very rich sonic palette of the neighborhood. And even now too, I can hear the kids playing in the yard there and near Carole's place.
Thank you for chatting a bit about some of the stories that came out of your interviews. And I'm sure we only see a portion of like the rich amount of dialogue that you had with these people that you interviewed. And I was wondering, how did you make these sort of editorial decisions, and how did you decide what was going to go with what? Because I felt like when I was reading the book, I was like, oh, okay, here's a character. We're calling them a character because I don't know this person personally, but I was like, oh, that gets brought up in another oral history. And I feel like there's almost a narrative that's getting developed as I read along through the text. So I was wondering, what were some of the editorial decisions you had to make, or transcription decisions?
Well, first of all, we didn't transcribe the interviews. There was a transcriber who was hired by the oral history program. And we were very grateful for that, because I had done transcription and I knew how painstaking it was. Carole, do you remember we somehow rented this space in one of the old brick buildings by the rail tracks down by the harbor? Mm-hmm. And that's where we did all the editing, in this old, I think it must have been a warehouse. And the trains would go by with their shunting and so on, and then it would be hard to hear the recording, but and we had lots of discussions about how to keep the voice of each of the interviewers as intact as possible on the page. That was definitely a goal we had. So we had to decide what could stay, because a transcriber will even do, with every pause, will do ... So we had to just decide what we kept and what we got rid of. It took a long time. I don't know how long, Carole. I don't know if you remember how many months it took.
Also, this was before internet, so when we were editing, it was you know, the actual cut and paste. You know, you have an X-Acto knife and you have your glue and you're pasting things together. To jump a little bit, when that original was finally pasted together and the whole thing was edited, it had to go back to Victoria, which for people in Montreal, I have to explain, is across a big body of water that we go by ferry. And this pasted together manuscript was in a briefcase. It wasn't Daphne or I who lost it on the ferry, it was our boss. And what had happened is that he forgot to pick it up, the briefcase up, when he left the ferry. And there was just general panic as he had to tell us about this and and explain it to his superiors as well. And you know that briefcase made about 3 trips back and forth across this body of water before someone said, "Oh, it must belong to somebody," you know. So it did get retrieved, but that's the jumping ahead a bit. But
Completely forgotten that, Carole.
A mistake anybody could make, really. It's like leaving a pot of rice on your stove while you go to a movie, isn't it?
I will say though, 50 years later, my heart just like skipped a beat for you guys hearing that.
Daphne and I talked an awful lot about keeping the voice to the page. I also thought, and now I was fairly new to editing and learning a lot from Daphne as we went along, that we were doing what's called a heavy edit. In so much as I think when people talk in a comfortable and generalized way, they jump from maybe one topic to another and then come back to another one. So we were perhaps assembling what they said about one subject all together in a paragraph. And I don't know that it makes much difference. It's more readable. Do you remember that, Daphne, at all, or will you?
Yeah, I do remember some of that. And I remember we decided to keep in all the ungrammatical constructions because that was part of how people spoke. And we couldn't keep in all of them, but we kept in as many as we could without breaking the flow of the telling. But keeping the flow of the telling going also was one of the things we wanted to do.
We omitted an awful lot of the laughter, Mathieu. There was during these, people could tell wonderful stories. They had great jokes they could tell, and they were always worth, you know, putting into the book. But what you don't hear in the book is the gales of laughter. And I think the laughter was a large part of it.
Yeah, it was.
I can really imagine that. I was curious too, you know, because you talked about the editing and trying to make sure there's some consistent voice, and also thinking, okay, this is a specific topic, so I'm going to put some of this together to make it, you know, thinking about the reader literally in this case. Mm-hmm. And so as a reader many years later, what I was curious about was, you know, if there was a specific decision or reason why you decided to not include your questions in these interviews.
Yeah, because we wanted that flow. The questions interrupted the flow. Mm-hmm. Would you agree to that, Carole?
Yeah.
Rereading it now, all these years later, wow, it is, what is it, almost 50 years later? I was struck by how strong the geography of the place is in the book. Especially the tidal flats of Falls Creek, where kids played a lot. And some people said, oh, you know, you'd never swim there because it was so polluted with sewage. And like kids say, oh yeah, when the tide came in, you know, it was great. we just go in. And then there was also, before the Port Authority took over the area around the old Hastings Mill, that was also another hobo jungle. There was one on each side of the neighborhood during the 30s. So one in the flats, the False Creek Flats, and one on the Harbor Flats, because Mary Chan's father had a little farm there, and he was expropriated by the government. But the streets, the actual streets, like people would say, well, Princess Street was mostly Jewish families, and Union Street and Prior Street were mostly Italian families. And then Atlantic was where all the good Catholics lived. They always went to mass every week. Now, why only on Atlantic Street? But I don't know. The way people designated parts of their neighborhoods. And Hogan's Alley, of course, was the subject of a number of comments and conversations. Austin Phillips was a wonderful storyteller about Hogan's Alley, because he was a musician who played in many of the places there, and he gave the names of different places that people went to, and which one sold which kind of wine. Yes.
I have a sort of follow-up question from that, given that you just said is, how, with all the narratives and all the different places and, specific communities that you were talking to, how did the publication resonate with those communities once it was out?
Well, Benny's Market sold copies for several years after it came out. Union Market also sold some copies. They're the Portuguese market. Actually, I was in Super Value on the Drive in Il Mercado. You know where it is, Carole. And I was astonished a couple of weeks ago, a few weeks ago, more than a couple. They have a little rack with books by local people or about local history right by the cashier stand. And there was a copy of Opening Doors. And when I went back the next week, it was gone. So somebody must have bought it.
I remember, Mathieu, when the book first came out, of course, each person in the book received a copy of it, and we made sure there was also an audio cassette of their voices, so that the family or the person who, if they were still alive, got both the written transcription in the book, and then the or the edit in the book, and then the actual tape recording. And I often wondered, well, is some family going to say, well, you sure chopped it up before you put it into print? Or they might say, gee, we had no response. No one said anything to us, as I recall, about the discrepancy maybe between the tape. I'm talking about sequence of subject matters mostly, and what came out in the book. Everyone seemed very, very happy, I think, with what they saw.
Yeah, well, I think there's that distinction between, like sometimes we tend to think that verbatim is more honest somehow or closer to reality, but I think actually in hearing it, the mind groups these things together anyway. It makes a sequence and a narrative of its own accord, and so in a way, it's almost more faithful to the hearing of it to give it that sort of form.
Yeah, interesting. That's interesting. Yeah,
and I think a lot of the people were really very pleased and proud, and then their families were too, that the memories of their elders were being recorded and published this way, and that the book became really the first printing, especially. I think there was a second printing of that, right, Daphne? And then the second. I'm using the wrong terms here, aren't I? But
second edition.
Yes, edition. Yeah. Again, referring to my neighbor, Mr. Crossetti, I saw his obituary in the newspaper. I can't remember when, but there was a mention made in there that he'd been part of this book. And I thought, the family is proud of him. They're pleased that, he's being honored this way. Yes.
That's so wonderful.
Do you remember, Carole, we were asked to come and give a little talk to the SRA, which is the Strathcona Residents Association, and do a book signing there. And a number of people came and bought books, and it was quite a large audience actually. So people were interested. Yeah.
So you're talking about the editing process and the literal cut and paste. I'm sure the manuscript was like twice the size from having layered over and layered over.
Yeah.
But I was wondering how the activities that you engage in oral histories, so things like listening, editing, thinking about the continuity of a story, thinking about that real sort of like essence of the voice. How does that relate to your other creative work as writers and as artists, or does the one inform the other?
Well, the first thing that I thought of when you were asking that question was that, and of course this speaks to my new book, Then Now, was that my father was a great storyteller, and the colonial culture in Penang was full of stories. People would entertain, they'd get together and they would entertain each other with stories. So storytelling was sort of part of my heritage, I guess, growing up. But writing poetry is a very different experience, because there's not, well, the kind of poetry I write, I guess, there's not a narrative arc to follow, although I have written 2 novels, and of course I'm interested in narrative, but it's a different way of moving in language. And certain words will spark all kinds of associations. It's more constellation-like, whereas narrative is more like a through line.
Yeah. What about you, Carole?
Well, I didn't come into it as a writer primarily. I am an artist. And I remember being so subsumed by what we were doing that I didn't do anything else during those 2.5 years. I didn't do any of my other work. I was totally involved in this. It was very new to me. And afterward, I didn't know if I wanted to ever do it again either. Part of that had to do with the incredible amount of work there is to do when you're gathering an oral history or a set of them. I think a lot of people think you plunk down a tape recorder, make sure it's on, and then get the elders to speak. But it goes far beyond that. If you're going to present something that's really meaningful and has context. I stayed away from gathering oral history again. I had the opportunity quite a few times, and I said, no, I'm not going to do it again. But then once I did, of course, because the local community center, which is called Carnegie Community Center at Hastings and Maine, asked me if I would record a few of their elders. And this was maybe 2 years later, and it was far more informal. And these were outstanding people, and they were some of the people that we maybe missed in our initial gathering, and I just loved tape recording them and loved listening to their stories, and could soon enough forget that there was a machine on between us, that it was a real pleasure to be listening to stories. I don't know if I'm answering it in the same direction, but
doesn't matter.
in the same way. But there was it seemed like a very different thing to do than what I did afterward as well.
Carole, you did some early writing.
Thank you, Daphne.
And in all the background of this, of course, I'm thinking of Roy, who's making artworks out of conversations with people. So thinking that the two sometimes might not be so distant, at least in his estimation anyway. I thought maybe I would just take it in a slightly different direction and ask, given that you've lived in the neighborhood for quite some time now, and also maybe just to point out from a very personal vantage that one of the things that really stood out to me in reading this book was that I felt a sort of overwhelming affective response to the descriptions of anti-Asian racism in the book and how that's carried forward to this particular moment in time when I think we're in a resurgence of that in a really visible, ugly way in the wake of this pandemic. So that being one example and a negative one, I suppose, but are there continuities between the neighborhood as it was then and things that you see now?
Well, I feel that it's a very changed and changing neighborhood. Real estate prices have shot up, of course. And there's a whole new class of young professional people, families with families moving in. For a while, Strathcona School must have had quite a low population of students. It certainly doesn't now. There are many, many more children. And of course, with COVID, many, many more dogs in the neighborhood. There's a connection with the struggles, the economic struggles that people had with the homeless camp in Strathcona Park, of course. Most of the Chinese people here now are seniors, elders. You know, we nod to each other when we pass each other on the street because a number of them do their daily morning walk around the park or along radiating streets. And I walk my dog at the same time. And one of the things that I like doing is greeting people on the street. And of course now with COVID, we're all masked and it's harder to recognize people, but you recognize by the way people walk, their gait. When we first moved, we've lived here now, Bridget and I have lived here now almost 21 years since coming back. When we first moved in, you could always hear the Tai Chi music in the morning in the park. And there would be a nice group, quite a large group of people doing it. And we heard somebody complained about the music. And now there's only a solitary person maybe doing it to a very small amount of music on his cell phone or something like that.
That's a shame.
I there this morning like that. Yeah. There's a language barrier still with the senior citizens. It's very present. But for instance, we have neighbors on one side of our strata, Chinese family, and we heard that they had COVID, and there was some concern among a number of white neighbors that they were getting enough food, and people checked, we checked, and they said they were fine, but it's really hard to break through that language difference. Yeah. I heard a great story from my son, who has a friend who's Métis, and he was in a parking lot, this isn't in this area, where he saw a guy get out and harass this senior Chinese man who was talking to two younger Chinese guys, and this harasser was saying, "Go back to your own country." And he started to push the older guy. So my son's friend got out and he said, "What are you doing? You go back to your country. This is my country. I'm Métis. This is my country. You go back to your country." I thought that was terrific.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah. What about you, Carole? Are there threads that continue or things that disrupt that come to mind?
I live in this large housing co-op called Modern Gardens, And it was built especially to help resettle many Asians who were forced out of the area during the city's urban renewal plans. And it's on this, it's almost a city block long, and it houses a great many people. And we're almost like a village within a village. It's a different way of living than how Daphne is living right now. It's maybe hard for people in very large and cosmopolitan cities to see what we see. I would see by this, but I don't think I'm quite as connected to Strathcona, although the housing co-op borders it on two sides. Here I'm gesturing, Deanna. Did you see? But one of the groups of people who were a large group of immigrants, I believe they were refugees, who came here after or while in the 1970s, in the late 70s, who we didn't meet, and many of them moved into Modan Gardens, and these were the Vietnamese people who had come, I think, via camps in Malaysia. Maybe they'd spent 2 years. Do you know, Daphne? And I have met many of these Vietnamese people now living here, and that's and the subsequent generations who are quite fluent in English. And that's opening my eyes in another direction too, because they were so very welcomed here, and they felt very welcomed here, and they've thrived here. And of course, everyone loves Vietnamese food, right? So that's a big one. True. Yeah. It's a different neighborhood. We're also in the center of probably Vancouver's opioid crisis. There's a level of street people that I see that I have never seen. I've never seen a population this big before, and this is very worrying. It has a lot to do with the COVID pandemic and the acute poverty that's around. I see that more than ever before, and it's I'm not speaking of tens of people, I'm speaking of hundreds of people who are sleeping on sidewalks, in door fronts, and at any time of the day or night. And sometimes it's so crowded, you're almost stepping over them to move along. It's very worrying. It's very concerning. And it's I see things that I didn't see when I lived just 4 blocks inland into Strathcona Neighbourhood. Perhaps you would call that parochial, I don't know, but it's another set of eyes. I had been accused so often of wearing rose-colored glasses as we put opening doors together, because people were giving us very poignant stories, but also I remember going out for dinner with a very, well after the book was published, being invited out to dinner by a very astute gentleman. And he wanted to know why we hadn't really got into the teeth of things, you know, and I quite didn't know what he wanted, what he was getting at. But in his group of people and his ethnic background, there were far more stories that hadn't been told yet. That was basically what he was saying. And you know what's happened, the good thing out of that kind of look is that there are now more oral histories coming out, and all of these ethnic groups have claimed it for themselves, which is really, really important and good to hear.
Right. Yeah, and some people have criticized us for not painting the darker side of the picture here, because there was crime here before. I mean, before our day here. But I loved what Ines Leland said. She said, growing up here, you see the good side and the bad side. You never see just the good side. And she meant that people on the West End are insulated, the west side of the city are insulated. They just see the good side. They don't see the bad side. And that there's an advantage to growing up and having experience with both sides.
Two people in the book especially spoke in detail about the pandemic of 1918, 1919. And I've earmarked, I'd like to know where that term comes from, but one of them, and I'll read what she says. Is that all right?
Yes, please.
Yeah, it's Violetto Benedetti, and this is Mr. Benedetti's mother, who went on to be a great friend of mine, or I should put it the other way around. I don't know. In 1918, there was the flu time. It took all the big men, the healthy ones, and the little skinny Marenks, they all lived. My mother had the garlic in the garden, and she made a string of beads for all of us. We wore this raw garlic on our neck to keep the flu away. As editor, may I add, that probably kept other people away as well. So distancing, right? And then she says, you can imagine the smell. Now we put an exclamation point after that sentence of hers, which probably means we all laughed an awful lot. Right? and then she goes on to say, and we use garlic water for worms. Now she's talking about bodily worms, not about worms in your garden, right? They knew that. And she said, anything from Mother Nature, from the earth is good. Like I say, when the world was made, did God make a drugstore on the corner? He put the herbs for the animals and the herbs for us. That flu was terrible. Everybody in the sick family took sick. And I was about 13 and I had cleaned the house from top to bottom, washed and waxed all the floors, the windows, everything, like I knew something was going to happen. All of a sudden I started to get dizzy. I guess a fever was working and I was going up the stairs like a drunk on my hands and knees, and I climbed into bed. My brother-in-law came. We left the doors open at night and day, and he came in and he had a glass of whiskey. I'd never drank in my life, a kid 13 years old, and he made me drink it. He just held my nose and made me swallow it. The Victorian Order of Nurses were good. If it wasn't for them, let me see, you would all be dead. They used to come with soup and sheets and pillowcases and everything. Once in a while, I'd sneak out of bed and I'd look through the blinds. You'd see a hearse going up and down, taking all these dead people away. Think of New York City a little over a year ago. The same thing was happening. Eh? And then she says, back in where Tosie's store is now was T. Edwards, the undertaker parlor, and the bodies were stacked there like cordwood. So I want to say that about what she saw.
Yeah, no, I that stuck out to me definitely in those interviews as well.
Me too. I chatted about it with my partner because I was like, oh my gosh, does it ever feel real? You know, I lived in Vancouver for a few years, and reading this on a very rainy day, it felt like I was able to transport myself over there and really think about what it meant to be, maybe, you know, in that time and place. And it was a really enriching experience to be able to learn from all the multiple voices and the multiple oral histories and the different perspectives from the different communities. Of course, like you said, one of the challenges is, you know, missing one group by, you know, or one group feeling less represented. But it still felt like there was a lot of different narratives working together and also like challenging each other in some ways and saying, you know, this happened. No, it didn't. Actually, this happened. And that was really helpful for thinking about what you just said, which was, you know, seeing the good and the bad, but like more nuanced perspective of that part of Vancouver. My takeaway is thank you for doing this, for giving me the opportunity to ask you a few questions, but to listen to you.